Welcome back, everyone, and well done for getting back so promptly. So I won't delay. We'll get straight into. We have a conversation, but I think we should be calling it a fireside chat. So I understand we do actually have a fireside, which is quite remarkable. And this is for James Stewart from KPMG and futurist Matthew Griffin. Over to you guys.
Thanks, Amanda. I've been put to shame by Matthew actually because I am certainly not by a fireside, but he certainly is. Yeah. Maybe we should spend the next half an hour, Matthew, you explaining how you've put that little set together. But I'm not sure that's within our brief. Anyway, welcome everybody. Matthew Griffin. We're just gonna have a chat. We had sort of had a conversation yesterday. I can tell you this could go absolutely anywhere. This conversation. But Matthew is the CEO of the 311 Institute and the World Futures Forum. I think he was the founder of both as well. He doesn't really like being called a futurist, although that's probably what lots of people would call him. He prefers to be called a strategic advisor. But basically, he spends his time thinking about what's going to happen next. I think that's the best way to describe it.
Absolutely.
We're going to focus on infrastructure, which Matthew spends quite a lot of time thinking about. And Matthew, maybe a good place to start before we look into the future is your view on what's happening at the moment.
Yeah. So thank you, James, and welcome to my mansion. It's not a virtual studio at all. That's it. And Merry Christmas, everybody. So I'm just waiting to open the presents under my tree. So when we start having a look at infrastructure, particularly through COVID, even before COVID arrived, there were a huge number of questions about what the future of infrastructure looks like, whether it was education, whether it was healthcare, transportation, energy, and so on and so forth. Because there are so many different underlying trends that are impacting the future and starting to change how we, for example, not just build infrastructure, the physical stuff, but also how we use the products and services that are based around that infrastructure. And COVID has accelerated a lot of those now. So just giving you a couple of examples, when we have a look at transportation, we saw the increasingly rapid deployment of autonomous vehicles, particularly over in the US as well as through Europe, because people couldn't make deliveries, people couldn't get food. This is particularly during lockdown and so on and so forth. So we had companies like Drive, who were all of a sudden granted approval by the US regulators to deliver food packages to homeless people and so on and so forth. When we have a look at energy, green energy, should we call it, was already upticking. But again, when you have a look at the European Union, the UK, when you have a look at China, when you also have a look at probably the new US administration, everyone typically talks in terms of a green recovery. So there's a lot of investment now going into that. And of course, when you start having a look at green energy, a lot of new green energy technologies, renewables, for example, basically are typically decentralized in nature, which then lend themselves quite well to being aggregated together on blockchain platforms so that you can create virtual power plants. And we've seen quite a number of states in the US who have now opted for virtual power plants as opposed to physical, for example, coal-fired power plants. So the trends that were there before have now just been boosted, put on steroids and accelerated.
But if you look across a number of sectors. If you were looking at infrastructure, how does that compare to other sectors in terms of the adoption of technology and embracing change?
Very slow. I'll be honest. I mean, even if you have a look at hospitals again through COVID, we're starting to switch much more to telehealth. When you have a look at investors are all diving into artificial intelligence and anything to do with telemedicine and telehealth. The fact of the matter is that a lot of infrastructure projects are still very large. If you have a look at Sizewell, it's what, £32 billion. We have HS2, obviously in the UK, which is now what, £16 billion. When we have a look at the US infrastructure spending, they talked about spending $1 trillion on building out infrastructure. When we actually, there's kind of this disconnect between we can see what the future looks like because we can see it emerging, we can quantify it, we can use the different products or services that are being built today. But when it comes to building infrastructure or infrastructure projects up and out, we still build roads in a traditional way. We are still for the main part, thinking about building power stations, even though alternatives are available. And a lot of that thinking really comes from, on the one hand, governments are kind of stuck in, particularly governments are sort of stuck in this, between this rock and this hard place. They know that if you have a look at mobility, the future is electric, and it's generally going to be semi-autonomous or fully autonomous. But do you really want to be the government that bets the farm on this fully autonomous, fully electric future, while you're sort of sitting in the House of Commons and your opposition are there saying, that's all fantastic, but if this future doesn't materialise, you've just wasted tens of billions of pounds, you're idiots. So then we start talking about playing safe, and that's where risk, politics, bureaucracy start playing a role, which then ultimately means that when we do arrive at the future, we start questioning who built this stuff and why isn't this stuff future-proofed? And that's a good question.
Yeah, well, I think we might come back to that because I think it's a really interesting topic for us.
Yeah.
Just while I'm remembering, if you've got a question for Matthew or there's a topic you'd like me to raise, then chuck it in the chat and somebody will tell me about it because I can't see the chat. Someone will tell us about it.
Yeah.
We have a way. But Matthew, let's just have a quick scan across the sectors in terms of what you think is going to happen in the future. Maybe we can start with transportation and energy.
Yeah.
Because those are probably the two big ones.
Yeah, certainly. So if we start with energy first, so when you have a look at the cost of electricity generation, you can break energy into three kind of areas. You've got energy generation, energy distribution, and then energy retail. When we have a look at energy distribution first, we're already starting to see a whole variety of long-range wireless transmission systems coming through. For example, particularly in New Zealand, where rather than building out pylons or burying pipes and things underground, you're able to transmit significant quantities, megawatts, basically over long distances wirelessly. So New Zealand is typically leading the charge on that one because it's a very mountainous country, and obviously putting pylons and digging your way through mountains is horrifically expensive. So that's energy distribution, which really can be encompassed in a future basically that increasingly looks wireless. And there's a variety of different wireless technologies that we can use, from microwave to laser energy transmission, as well as RF and a couple of other things as well. When we have a look at energy generation, though, as well, when we start talking about energy generation is already starting to get to the point where, when you have a look at renewables, we can already see a point in time where energy generation itself will effectively be free. As we start breaking away more and more from fossil fuels, where the energy costs increase or decrease depending on the oil or gas price of the day, or whatever the hedges are, when we start having a look at, for example, renewables, so wind, solar, all these kinds of different technologies, go and have a look on Google, have a look at the cost of electricity generation graphs, and they're all doing this. Over in Dubai, they're now generating electricity, unsubsidized renewable electricity, for about 0.23 cents per kilowatt hour.
Just to be clear, when you say free, you're talking about the marginal cost of generation, not necessarily the cost of paying off the capital cost of the asset.
Absolutely, yes, and that's a sort of different kettle of fish. So, for example, when we have a look at solar, a lot of the solar panels, just taking that as an example, a lot of the solar panels that are deployed today are silicon-based. They're typically 17 to 20% efficient. Perscovite solar panels, which can be 3D printed, are typically 22 to 32% energy efficient. We already have technologies with the US Department of Energy. We have prototypes that are 48% efficient. If you put bacteria into a solar panel, you get to 50% energy efficiency. If you use carbon nanotubes in a silicon solar panel to reclaim heat, you get to 80% energy efficiency. And then if you use something called black silicon, and this sounds impossible, but the physics actually hold up, and this has been demonstrated. If you use black silicon to create your photodetectors and solar panels, you can get to 132% energy efficient. So bearing in mind that a recent Bloomberg NEF report stated that the cost of renewable energy generation is already the cheapest form of energy generation as well as energy projects from a TCO, an ROI, a long-term sort of perspective, is the cheapest in the world. When you start looking at fossil fuels, they're dead economically, outside of just culturally when we talk about the green revolution. So that's energy. When we have a look at transportation, we're sort of in this very difficult phase at the moment from a societal perspective, where we have to drive cars, for example. We have semi-autonomous vehicles, which are typically category 2, category 3 vehicles on the roads already. So you can think of your Teslas that kind of drive themselves on autopilot. We have category 5 vehicles coming through next year, which will be available via a software update, for example, Tesla again. So we're moving from, should we say, manual to semi-autonomous vehicles to fully autonomous vehicles. And when you look at fully autonomous vehicles, it's estimated that we can take about 30 to 50% of the cars off the road. The reason for that is today your car sits in your driveway 95% of the time, or if you're in lockdown, 100% of the time if you're behaving. So all of a sudden, we can see a future where we have technically fewer cars on the roads, but they have greater capacity. But from an infrastructure perspective, we've kind of got to build for today and the transition period. And that's the difficult thing. You've got to kind of balance. And then you have the electrification. So for example, today we build out supercharger networks around the UK and Europe, but we can already see wirelessly charged electric vehicles coming through with the likes of Hyundai, Toyota, BMW, which then fundamentally changes how you deploy your supercharger networks. And that's before we start getting, again, to solar-powered vehicles, again, like Toyota and Hyundai have already released, that don't need batteries in their traditional form, or even structural batteries where the car itself, the car's chassis itself, is actually the battery. So there's lots and lots going on in that transportation space. And then we have not just fully autonomous cars or vans or trucks, but we've got fully autonomous electric cargo ships up to 250,000 tons. We've got fully autonomous aircraft. Recently Airbus tested a fully autonomous A320 out of Charles de Gaulle. So the entire transportation sector is flipping. And then in addition to that, if you consider this, we're already seeing the death of the car. Because if I take away your pedals, if I take away your car's dashboard, and I take away your steering wheel, do you have a car? Or do you have a pod? And that fundamentally changes how we think of these vehicles. You know, I won't have a car parked in my driveway. I will have a pod on demand from wherever it comes from. So there's lots happening there. But again, with a lot of these different technologies, the challenge is the transition period. How do you plan? You're here, you need to get to here. A lot of companies and governments call that crossing the chasm, because this bit in the middle is the challenging piece to try to balance and get right.
But listening to that sort of comparison between energy and transportation, it sounds like the energy timescales are quicker than the transportation timescales. I'm just interested, when you think transportation is going to fundamentally change in the way you just described.
Yeah. With both, you have a deployment issue. So for example, even if we had fully autonomous vehicles tomorrow, let alone electric vehicles tomorrow, you know, we had the perfect fully autonomous category 5 EV. The fact of the matter is we've still got to cycle through all the old vehicles on the roads. It's estimated that to make enough vehicles to replace all the older vehicles that are on the roads, it will take about 20 years. You know, when you have a look at Volkswagen's production rates and all this sort of stuff. So for transportation, getting from where we are today to the end game is, even if we ramp up production and we account for fewer cars and vehicles actually on the road, it's still 15 years. When you have a look at the future of energy, we recently passed over 1 trillion watts of installed renewable electricity around the world. The world at the moment has over 6 trillion watts of installed electricity generation. And from an investor perspective, it's almost getting to the point where we just flip one type of energy generation facility. If you look at Centrica have been selling their gas-powered, their gas and nuclear sort of interests basically for a while now. But in the energy generation space, we have the opportunity to either deploy renewables, so whether it's 85-story tall wind turbines off the North Sea, or we can build a power plant like Sizewell B. It's quicker, increasingly quicker to ramp up and accelerate the deployment of renewable energy products and platforms than it is to flip global transportation.
Okay, we've got a question on energy, which I'm going to put you now. Yeah. Is there a futurist view of zero carbon heating all our buildings Is there a futurist view of zero carbon heating for all of our buildings, or is that up to boring engineering?
It's both. So engineering actually isn't boring. I'm going to correct whoever said that there. So hopefully they like me correcting them as well. Engineering is fundamental to the future. Now, when we have a look at zero carbon heating, in 2025, the UK government has dictated that all new build homes have to be off the gas grid. So we have the electrification of new build homes in the UK. Once you start electrifying, should we say, homes and heating, you can use any type of source that you like. So in the UK, and this is sort of some good news for the UK, I talked about the rapid development of new solar technologies. If you put a thin layer of graphene over a silicon solar panel, you can generate electricity from your solar panels in the UK when it rains. In addition to that, if we use nanophotonic materials, we can turn your solar panel into a lunar panel and it can generate electricity at night.
Okay, it's just a sec, you just lost me.
Yeah.
Nanophotonic.
So one of the problems that we've had trying to generate more electricity from solar panels is trying to capture these very small wavelengths of light. And new manufacturing technologies, which is an engineering problem, new manufacturing technologies are increasingly allowing us to create what we call nanophotonic materials that can capture these very, very small wavelengths of light and then turn them into electricity. So in answer to the question, when we have a look at the future of heating, bearing in mind that globally, I think I'm right in saying that heating accounts for about 30% of all energy consumption. And that's heating, not cooling like aircon. We do have quite a clear and distinct path to a zero carbon future for heating homes. And those technologies are accelerating, they're increasingly being deployed, they're increasingly affordable and available and commercial. So that's looking good from that perspective.
Okay, this is an indulgence on my part. Transportation. I mean, at the moment, most transportation goes along the ground, whether it's a train or a car.
Yeah.
So what use are we going to make of airspace above a road so we get sort of three-dimensional lanes of traffic?
Yeah. Okay. I like your question. So that takes us straight into sky taxis. So forget flying cars. Go straight to sky taxis. Sky taxis, you can think of a sky taxi as realistically just a giant drone that people can sit in. That's it. Flying cars, they're dead. They never really took off, excuse the pun. So when we have a look at using three-dimensional airspace, again, you've got a variety of different problems and challenges to overcome. There's firstly the technology challenge. Now, we've actually generally overcome that. We've got 8-seater passenger vehicles with companies like Sky, which are hydrogen-powered flying taxis. We have eHang and Volocopter, which is owned by Mercedes, as well as Airbus and BMW solutions, as well as Porsche, who want to create the ultimate in flying taxis. So we've got the technology to create flying taxis that can safely and reliably transport people from A to B, either using lithium-ion batteries or hydrogen. Hydrogen's quite a good one because you can get a 400-kilometer range on a hydrogen flying taxi. So we've got the technology. Culturally, people aren't quite there yet. If I had a flying taxi that you could get into, and we have these in Dubai, do you want to get into a fully autonomous flying taxi? So culturally, you've got to get over that hump. From a regulator's perspective, regulators across Europe, particularly Germany, the UK-ish and the US as well as Singapore are actually approving the first flying taxi flights already. Volocopter is selling flying taxi flights for $300 and they can transport you either between cities or just regionally. Uber Elevate just got sold, but you've got to solve the airspace problem because essentially one of the greatest challenges that you have is when you have a look at the CAA, for example, as well as the FAA, they're used to trying to track A320s, 747s, Airbus A380 aircraft. They're not really equipped at the moment to track something that's the size of literally a flying car or a flying van. So we've got organizations over in New York, as well as the US military and Singapore who are working on these airspace management problems. And those technologies, these green corridors or these air corridors are now starting to come through. So the cost of producing a flying taxi is typically about $250,000, but that's when you then sell it as a service. If you have a look at Uber Elevate, so technology always reduces in cost over time. If you have a look at Uber Elevate at the moment is their platform can now transport you from A to B at the cost of a regular sort of posh taxi. However, in about 3 years' time, they estimate that the cost of transporting you from A to B will be cheaper than you can go in your car. So technology always dumps prices, frankly. So the future's bright for flying taxis, but we've got regulator issues, liability issues, technology issues are kind of solved, and then cultural issues, and that's why it'll take longer to see them actually coming through than many people expect. Even though it'd be good. They're fun, I've been in one. Still here.
So, by the way, the boring engineer says new homes are the easy bit.
Yeah, oh, there you go, yes. He's absolutely right. That's it. Although I can take him off of the grid completely, basically with renewables. So we can have a conversation about about disconnecting yourself from the national grid.
Now, there's been a question on this. The question is, can governments overcome that risk-averse approach you referred to, and how do they do that while not leaving themselves open to the criticism of wasting money?
Yeah.
But it was a topic I wanted to pick up, which is this sort of investment life cycle. How, do you invest in something like HS2 or a major roads program, which is going to take a long time when all this new technology is on the horizon? How does government approach that, given that if the new technology doesn't arrive, they are just going to get it in the neck?
Yeah. Well, firstly, and this is where personally I think one of the problems that governments have basically is short-term thinking, because any government outside of President Xi and Vladimir Putin, you're elected for generally 4 years. You can't go off and spend huge amounts of money on vanity projects. Say, for example, the UK government said, we're going to spend £100 billion building out future-proofed infrastructure. You'd get everybody saying, in some cases rightly, why don't you invest that instead in hospitals and education? So from a politician's perspective, they are voted in for a period of 4 years, and you've got to kind of argue, if they invested in something that is really only going to start generating a proper return in, say, 10 years, let alone anything longer, that's a risk. And frankly, do you want to put yourself in front of, say, the House of Commons or Lords and try to defend it, or just take the easy approach? And then, of course, from a bureaucratic perspective, just have a look at HS2. HS2 is a 250-mile-an-hour train. Over in Nevada, we are testing hyperloops, which are essentially trains in vacuum tubes that can travel at up to Mach 1. Over in China, they're developing a hyperloop, really starting 2025, that will go at Mach 3. That's 2,500 miles an hour. You start changing the dynamics of the airline industry in that sort of example. I could quite easily argue that you should be investing in something like the Hyperloop rather than HS2. But of course, Hyperloop is a new technology. It's still sort of finding its way. even though over in the UAE we've signed MOUs now to actually deploy the first Hyperloop networks from sort of 2021 onwards. Most Western governments particularly are risk averse, but one thing that I keep seeing time and time again is for non-Western governments and for governments who lead sort of typically the G7 to G20 to G30 sort of space, they see these new technologies as a way to leapfrog the West and more developed societies. So it's actually the, shall we say, the tier 2 and tier 3 countries that are increasingly less risk averse, and they are looking at these futuristic technologies and pointing, going, the future's there, let's go there. And they're building to the future as opposed to hanging on to legacy. And in quite a lot of cases, again, it's got to be said, they aren't actually encumbered by quite a lot of the legacy things that we have. So, yeah, risk, politics and bureaucracy.
Yeah, so quite a lot of investors probably listening rather nervously to this. What's your advice to investors in infrastructure right now?
Yeah, so I actually advise a lot of investors, basically, so particularly global asset managers and everything else. And again, so on the one hand, it depends basically on the length of the portfolio that you're looking at. If you're looking at sort of short-term investments, 5 to 10 years, pretty much stick with what you're doing. If you're looking at investments sort of 10 to 20 years in terms of maturation, again, pretty much stick with what you're doing, but start hedging your portfolio a bit, start looking at different sort of options. If, however, you are looking at beyond 20 years in terms of maturation, there's a huge amount of change. But again, if you're looking to invest in Western countries, realistically, you're going to be in that safe bucket. You're going to be investing in the future of roads that we see today, that fall apart today, as opposed to the roads that heal themselves and that are smart and all that kind of stuff tomorrow. So my general advice is have a look at the length of your portfolio, have a look at when you want to exit or when you want to be able to recoup your gains. The shorter your view, play it kind of business as usual. The longer your view, start mixing your portfolio up a little bit, but particularly if you're looking outside of really Europe and the US. Yeah.
Good. Okay.
There's a whole conversation there. So, yeah.
So, Matthew, what's your bet on? Okay, the sort of bright new technology that none of us have ever heard of.
Yeah. Oh, so in any space or just or infrastructure. So.
Well, go a little.
Okay.
Not pure infrastructure.
Yeah.
Something reasonably close.
Okay. So I'll mix it up a little bit. So. Today we're already at the point where, from a infrastructure perspective, when we think about physical infrastructure, we are already starting to 3D print different buildings, whether those are homes, whether those are offices or government buildings. We'll start 3D printing bridges and everything else. Now, increasingly, we're able to 3D print energy infrastructure as well as a whole variety of other different types of infrastructure into those 3D printed buildings. One of my favorites at the moment is when you have a look at the nuclear industry. Typically, we think that renewables could kill the nuclear industry. On the one hand, we have mini reactors coming through, courtesy of sort of Rolls-Royce and the like. But the US Department of Energy recently 3D printed a complete nuclear reactor, complete with nuclear core in a lab. And when you have a look at that, all of a sudden you can 3D print mini nuclear reactors very quickly. They can be regulated and approved very quickly because you've got the specs. Now, in that particular case, that particular nuclear reactor was designed by an artificial intelligence as well. So when we start thinking about energy, some of the technologies that are left field are, we have creative machines that are artificial intelligences that are increasingly being used to help us innovate new products and services. I'll give you a quick energy example. Normally, that's right. So normally to produce a new electric vehicle battery takes 2 years. Using an artificial intelligence, Toyota did it and tested it in 16 days. So you can get artificial intelligence to design new infrastructure and assets. And then we can use rapid prototyping, and then we can typically start 3D printing them, and you can get them into the market much, much faster. So that's my left curve. That's my left field one for you, James.
Well, thank you. I said at the beginning that we could go anywhere, and we have gone anywhere, and we could chat forever, but we need to go and join our panel.
Yep.
So, Matthew, thank you very much on behalf of everybody, and we'll talk in a minute on the panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone.